I'm of the view that I think democracies, their shape has changed, and I think more for the worse. And I think it has been shaped or reshaped by technology, where we have gotten accustomed to equating freedom of expression with algorithmic amplification.
Well, greetings and salutations. My name is Don Emerson. I happen to run the Southeast Asia program at Stanford University, and I think you're going to enjoy the next 90 minutes. I think it's going to be stimulating and fun. At least I hope it will be. Um, Before I begin introducing our speaker today, I did want to satisfy a kind of institutional obligation that I have at Stanford University to advertise our product. Sorry, it sounds a little commercial for an academic, but we do run seminars and webinars and you name it, pretty much every day of the week. And if you would like to tap into any of our activities, including, of course, the activities of the Southeast Asia program, programs such as the one that you're about to watch, the way to do it would be to tap into the HTTPS, which is about to be shown on the screen, thanks to my assistant, Lisa, who's very helpful indeed. And so if you want to make a note of that, you can access our programs by simply typing that into your computer. And so maybe give you another second to write it down if anyone is interested in further connection with Stanford. Feel free to take a note of it. And I guess that's probably enough time. And thank you, Lisa, for that. Okay. First of all, the title of today's interview, because it is an interview, it's actually a conversation. I hope it'll be a conversation between the two of us, with an opportunity for you to ask questions posed at the Q&A toward the end of our conversation, if you happen to have questions. The title of today's session is Engaging Gita. And there's kind of a pun there, engaging in two senses. We are engaging Gita because he's right here. You can see him on the screen. But Gita himself is a very engaging personality, I guarantee you. And you will experience that in a few moments. Engaging Gita, a Renaissance Indonesian reviews his country and the world. Two questions obviously arise. Who is Gita Wirjawan? Now, many of the Indonesians will already know, but the non-Indonesians may not. And what is a Renaissance Indonesian? A Renaissance person is someone who has wide interests, very wide interests, and expertise plus experience in many different areas. A brief recap of Gita's biography will exemplify what I mean when I say that Gita is a Renaissance Indonesian. He is, and I'll go through this real quickly, he is the founding chairman of the Ancora Group of private equity investors and wealth managers in Indonesia. He has held leadership positions in Citibank, JP Morgan, and other such firms. His philanthropy sustains the Ancora Foundation, which seeks to improve access to quality education in Indonesia across a range of endeavors, from funding the training of kindergarten teachers to endowing scholarships for students to attend universities around the world, including, I might add, Stanford. His public service career has included heading Indonesia's trade ministry and investment coordinating board. His passion for sports led Gita to chair Indonesia's Badminton Association. His passion, his passion for sports and concerts meant that he has composed and played pieces in more than a dozen albums. He has performed as a jazz musician. His degrees include masters in business administration from Baylor and public policy from Harvard. Indonesia's School of Government and Public Policy, SGPP are the initials, sponsors his wide-ranging and very, very popular podcast, Endgame with Gita Wirjawan. And I'm going to start by asking a question that will require Gita to reflect on where he has come from and what he has been and how that shaped him. This is a biographical investigation here. Where and how, Gita, did you grow up? And with what consequences for the person you are now?
Thank you, Don. I spent the first 12 years of my life in Jakarta. I grew up in a setting where my dad was a medical doctor. My mom wanted to be a diplomat, but ended up marrying my father and becoming a housewife for the rest of her life. Thereafter, I moved to Bangladesh, where my dad was stationed as a medical doctor with the WHO. Thereon, I moved to India, where I stayed in New Delhi for 3 years before I started pursuing my tertiary education in the US. So I've grown up being exposed to liberal ideas that were evoked or provoked by my parents, particularly my dad, who spent some time in the US when he took his master's, but also being exposed to different cultures, different settings, where, to be quite honest, they were very challenging at times, particularly when I got to Bangladesh. I didn't know a word of English. I had to learn Bengali, I had to learn English. Then when I moved to India, it was quite very different from my experience in Bangladesh, much less the new experience in the US. But what I got out of that was that, you know, every time I got exposed to something new, it more than anything encouraged me to learn and be better, as opposed to discourage me from moving on and moving forward. It got, you know, to become a habit within me to just, you know, continue expanding my horizon to this day, even where I've learned to just familiarize myself with something that seems to be new. Sometimes some things that seem to be strange even. And I think it's net good, and it has helped me basically manage expectations by way of the, you know, varieties of experiences that I've gone through in the past few decades. So that's kind of like, you know, the short description of what I've gone through, you know, from the point I was born in Jakarta to the points where I was being exposed to different cultures and different settings, all the way to the point where I had to make a decision, you know, in terms of making career changes. I've gone into private enterprise, I've gone into social enterprise, I've gone into public enterprise, and that sort of like gives me comfort in that, you know, the optionalities that are within me are kind of like the kind of stuff that I think as many people as possible should have, because the world is a continuously changing environment.
Are there particular lessons that you could infer from that background that would be helpful to a young Indonesian or a young American who might not have had quite as international a background as you had, but might nevertheless benefit from your advice based on your experience?
Uh, well, I think there's quite a few lessons, right? The first lesson is that never be comfortable with what you have. And that, I think, is sort of like the advocacy I've been giving to, you know, lots of the young entrepreneurs or even techpreneurs, by way of the disruptions and dislocations that we've been going through in the last few decades. The second is that, you know, look out for something new out there proactively. Don't wait until something provokes you or pushes you to the boundaries. The third would be that, we all know this, right? In every country, only a very small percentage of the population would have passports. And that is, I think, by way of financial limitations, but I think to a lot of extent it's by way of the innate nature of human beings not to want to expose themselves to the outside world. And we live in an era where there's a lot of, misinformation or disinformation that's being disseminated through whatever medium that we're getting used to right now, call it the social media. And I think it's important to recognize that, it's upon us, or the onus is upon us to actually, editorialize whatever information or misinformation that we're getting from that sort of a medium. And one way to do that is to actually, go out and see the world. Because tensions are seemingly building up in a few places around the world, and these are tensions that are actually involving, great powers, and the repercussions of such tensions are just enormous for small, if not smaller, countries. I think it's upon everybody, be it in Indonesia or the world over, to basically just feel, what's outside.
Opportunity to feel what's outside in the direct sense of in-person experience is presumably limited depending upon your income and the opportunities that you have. And some people, unfortunately, are born with less opportunities, fewer than you have had, or for that matter, than I have had. Okay, well, that's a good beginning. I guess before we leave the topic, I would add one thing, because you and I have talked about this before, and that is, if a young person came to you in Indonesia and said, okay, Mr. Widjawan, I would like some advice. Should I dive into a particular pursuit, a particular discipline, for example, and become an expert in that discipline, because I would throw myself into it and I would learn it and I would be successful within that discipline, right? Or should I risk becoming a dabbler, knowing a little bit about a lot, but not much about anything, maybe with a shallow but wide-reaching knowledge? What would you answer to that person?
Well, this is sort of like, the discussion we had, right, over the hedgehog versus fox debate. I grew up thinking that accounting was the best thing, that anybody should do. It was a specialization that was, very popular in the 80s, and if you wanted to get a job, you better do it, or you become an engineer. And this would have been after years of aspiring to be an artist or a musician within me, right? And I have discovered thereafter that, it wasn't for me. And what we're seeing right now is similar to what I saw in the 80s, where, the tendency or the temptation to want to be a specialist, call it coding, is irresistible. But what I found was that being exposed to different verticals, different, dimensions, helps you not only see a wider horizon, but I think in the long run, it helps you with respect to building a better intuition for what's to come. And what's to come can come in many ways or manners, right? To the extent that you become overly specialized, I'm of the belief that that sort of like limits your intuitive capabilities. And that, I think, is a concern. Number two, to the extent that you become more of a generalist by way of being familiar, being exposed to a wide array of dimensions, that sort of like helps you with respect to mitigating long-term risk. You may not be as good as you would be in mitigating short-term risk. But I do believe that I think with respect to managing, if not mitigating long-term risk, you're better off by way of being more of a generalist. And I do say this with full sensitivity to the fact that you can't just be a generalist without actually deepening yourself within each one of the verticals. I think it is upon you, or it's upon us, to make sure that you have this breadth, but you have some degree of depth within each. And that, I think, makes you a more complete person than just being a specialist. And I'm not discounting the fact that, specialists are needed right now. But I do believe that for nation building purposes, institutional building purposes, I think you're better off by way of exposing yourself to a broader, if not more general, set of ideas.
That's from my point of view, good advice. Okay, now I want to shift to Indonesia. And as we proceed, the borderline between Indonesia and the world will, if not disappear entirely, become porous, because many of the issues that I hope we can discuss with regard to Indonesia are relevant outside of Indonesia. For just to give you a kind of an advance warning of the sort of topics that I have in mind, at least at the beginning of our conversation, these are issues that imply a certain criticism of Indonesia. Now, I'm an academic. I suppose some people might say that that's all that academics do, or they criticize, and if they had ever actually held a responsible position, for example, in public policy, they wouldn't be so critical because they would know how complex the world really is. And I'm very sensitive to that point of view. And I don't mean to suggest in emphasizing the negative, if you will, or pointing out the problems rather than the opportunities, perhaps. I don't mean to put down Indonesia at all. I've spent a lot of time in Indonesia, as you know, and I am optimistic about Indonesia's future, as I think you are as well.
Right.
But I just wanted to sort of say that by way of introduction. So here are a few topics that I thought we might be willing to explore. Corrupted governance, religious extremism, COVIDian infection, and climate change. Now, I know that's a huge array of topics. So we're not going to be able to do justice to any one of them, let alone to all of them. But let's just start on the corruption side. And I thought I would begin not with a sort of general question, but something a bit more specific. As you know, Gita, and I don't know if, as an academic, I'm always self-critical, and perhaps I'm formulating this in a way that is not as fair as it should be. And if so, I apologize. But I'll go ahead. As you know, corrupt politicians in Indonesia's legislature have been trying for some time now to muzzle the country's Corruption Eradication Commission, the KPK. President Joko Widodo, or better known, of course, as Jokowi, has been accused of failing to defend the independence of the KPK. Just a few months ago, in June of this year, the KPK said that 75 of its staff members had failed a civics exam imposed upon them to force the commission to lose its independence and become part of the police, an institution long known for endemic corruption. Who is complicit in this effort to censor the KPK, and what can be done about it?
No, it goes back to early days when I was tasked with promoting Indonesia. And whenever I began my narrative, I had always stated that, Indonesia is a corrupt country, right? But I think it's important to note that when we're trying to narrate a narrative, it's a long-term narrative. And when we're trying to narrate a long-term narrative, particularly for those that are going to be investing in Indonesia for the next 20 to 30 years, what matters to them is directionality, right? And directionality is all about whether we were going to be less corrupt or more corrupt 5 or 10 or 20 years down the line. And, I'm not in the business of being, a determinist, right? But I'm in the business of projecting optimism. And that optimism, I think, is driven by the fact that, we have been committed to allocating quite a lot of money for educational purposes. I'd like to believe that that's got some correlation with making sure that, we become a more global citizen by way of checking off all the boxes on good governance. But it doesn't mean that we haven't had a dent in that sort of directionality that we were trying to project. And I think you alluded to the event or the episode in June as something that I would regard as a dent, with respect to that directionality that we were all trying to project. But I think the belief or the core belief that I have and that I want people to have is that such things are episodic, right? They're a lot more cyclical than secular. And I do believe in the innate nature of Indonesia and Indonesians that we want to be better. And on that basis, I'm sort of like in a camp that believes that, okay, we had that sort of like episode that may not have been the most ideal in terms of, stemming, bad behavior. But I do believe that for the most part, I think Indonesians are gonna set back to, the path where we're gonna be able to maintain the kind of directionality that we've been talking about for the last, God knows, few years or few decades. And we have gotten better, by way of some of the other metrics that we can
Yeah,
talk
no, you're
about.
absolutely right. I mean, if you rank the countries of the world in terms of the Corruption Perceptions Index, which everybody uses, Indonesia is not in that bad shape. I mean, obviously there are countries in the world, in parts of Africa, for example, that are much more corrupt. So fair enough. I mean, I guess it does raise a political question, which is what is the best way to deal with corruption in a country, including Indonesia? And to put it rather schematically, I suppose there's the bottom-up view, that what you need is a vigilant and active civil society to check corruption, because they're the ones who are in a sense being hurt. And the other view is diametrically opposed. It's the top-down view, that you need a very, very strong state, maybe even a surveillance state, which is a phrase now being used quite often with the decline of democracy around the world. Do you have any thoughts on that, bottom up versus top down?
I'm sort of like in the bottom up type of camp. I'm a big believer that a bottom up kind of leadership entails a much more divergent way of thinking. It allows for real democratization of ideas. And here's what I think what's happening. We have seen by way of technological innovations a massive democratization of information or democratization of dissemination of information. But ironically or paradoxically, we're not seeing the necessary democratization of ideas. And such, lack of, if not absence of democratization of ideas has led the world, inclusive of Indonesia, to a place where we're seeing a high bifurcation of ideas, if not polarization of ideas. And that, I think, is a mockery. And you put that in the context of nation building, I think it's become difficult when you do not have the ability to democratize ideas. But you peel the onion a little bit more, if you can have divergence in your conversations, I think you have a greater chance of democratizing ideas. And that divergence, I think, could only happen if you allow the lower layers of an organization or of a nation to speak up, right? or to basically be able to articulate their ideas. And I think that's important. But if you overly rely on some sort of a top-down kind of leadership, you have to get lucky, to get better. You have to get lucky to get better if the top-down kind of leadership speaks with wisdom, speaks with the necessary kinds of stuff that's going to be good for the country and nation in the long run. But if you're not lucky, then I think you're off to a wrong path, not only for the short term, but for the long term. And that, I think, is a bit of a mockery with respect to, or within the context of democracies around the world, right? We have seen a number of democracies around the world where we have not seen a commensurate amount or degree of democratization of ideas, much less democratization of talents. We have seen where some democracies have been able to move recently by way of utilizing patronage for talent selection. That I think is counter, if not contrary, to the very soul or spirit of democracy.
Fair enough. I mean, there is a kind of ironic twist here, if I may. The democratization of ideas obviously has to take into account the kinds of ideas that are likely to be circulating in a democratized world. And in a democratized world, as in the United States, for example, the United States is deeply divided, deeply, deeply divided. And without in any way trying to adopt an elitist position that favors the educated, automatically, because the educated, I know a lot of academics that I wouldn't necessarily, classify all of them as profound, or for that matter, utterly ethical. Although don't misunderstand, I'm not casting aspersions on any colleagues here or any of my friends at all. But anyway, what I'm trying to say is that education is a critical ingredient. If the uneducated in parts of the country, frankly, tend to be red states, right, Republican dominated, and these are individuals who may not have had the opportunity to have a tertiary education, a higher education. But the lack of that level of educational knowledge and understanding limits them to ideas that frankly are, I don't want to say exactly dangerous, but that are divisive, extremely divisive.
Correct.
And I don't want to kind of exonerate the elites, because they then can respond very bitterly in kind and make things even worse. So what about Indonesian education? Is Indonesian education developing a base, a popular base, so that when we talk about the democratization of ideas, those ideas really will end up being in the interest of Indonesia?
Well, here's the thing. I'm net optimistic about the educational narrative of Indonesia, mainly from the point of view of how much we're actually allocating. We've been allocating 20% of the government budget for educational purposes. Granted, a chunk of that is not going to the right places, just by way of the sheer fact that a lot of that money is being decentralized to more than 500 points within the country, be it municipality, regency, provinces, where the leadership may not be able to understand the difference between OPEX and CAPEX. And that, I think, is a discount to the educational narrative. But I think net, it's moving in the right direction. But here's, I think, where structurally it's quite problematic. We've been focusing too much on curricula and the quality of students, right? Relatively speaking here. But we've not been focusing on the quality of teaching. And I've read studies on this, right? Where if you have a teacher who is in the top 20% graduating from an academic institution, he or she is likely to be able to teach within a year, about a year and a half's worth of teaching. But if you end up with a teacher who is in the bottom 20%, graduating from a particular academic institution, he or she is likely to be able to teach only half a year's worth of teaching within a year. And unfortunately, the quality of teachers in Indonesia is not at par with that in, call it, South Korea, that in Singapore. In South Korea, they've, consciously and conscientiously selected teachers from the top 5 to 10% of academic institutions, to the point where it has become a real cool social status for anybody to be a teacher, while they're actually being compensated really well being a teacher. And that I think aligns with why Stanford is where it is today, because the quality of teaching is so fantastic, right? And I do believe that correlates with the ability to democratize ideas. So I'm a big believer of the fact that if we were to rejig our educational narrative, I think we've got to rejig the way we take a view on our teachers. And here's the bonus, right? I mean, we live in a digital world right now. I'm actually okay with having fewer teachers, but they're actually great teachers, as opposed to a lot of teachers where many of them are actually not of great quality. And we can pipe that teaching, to the various spots in Indonesia digitally. And at the rate that they have 4G, if not 5G capabilities, right? And I'm very optimistic, actually. If this were to get taken a view of, I think we could be a totally different nation in the next 24, 25 years.
Yeah. I dare say that's the case. Well, just if I could raise the question of the content of the ideas that democratization would bring forward. If I may talk about somewhat invidious content, one might want to ask the question, what is the future of the Islamic Defenders Front? Without going into those details for members of the audience that are not familiar with the case, suffice it to say that it is an organization that represents an extreme version of Islam and has been associated with various activities over the years that are arguably in violation of democratic mores. So we have a presidential election in 2024. Is it your expectation that radical populist Islamism will play a significant role in that election?
I think it'll play some role, but I'm quite content with how it has seemingly receded in recent times. But I'd like to build this in a much bigger context. Let's be, open-minded about this. Extremism exists in just about every country, right? It does exist in the US. It does exist in the Middle East. It does exist in many European countries, African countries, and Latin American countries, and Asian countries. But if you put that in the context of how the historical narrative of, call it Southeast Asia, not just Indonesia, in the last 2,000 years, we have been graced by Buddhism for 400 years, Hinduism for 600 years, Islam, Christianity, colonization, independence, democratization, not to mention a point where a lot of people in the world, a lot of pundits in the world were alleging that we were going to get balkanized in a matter of months. And if you take into account the number of casualties by way of differences of opinions or views, ethnically, culturally, spiritually, religiously, in the last 2,000 years, it's minuscule compared to the kinds of casualties we saw in a span of 40 years between the World War I and World War II. We saw more than 100 million people getting killed in just 40 years. And our numbers don't even come up to near that sort of a number. I think it's indicative of the very DNA of Southeast Asia. Call it Indonesia also. That we love peace and stability. We love sustainability. And it goes back to the earlier point of how we're going to be able to educate our people, right? And I'm a big believer of the fact that religion is something that involves putting your interpretations by way of the values that are built within you. And the values within you are actually shaped by how your parents teach you, how your teachers teach you, how your bosses at work teach you, how your provincial governor teaches you, how your country's leadership teaches you. And I think if you take into account the equation where more and more people in Indonesia are going to get taught the right set of values, that's going to automatically help reduce any militant tendencies anywhere, not just in Indonesia.
Good. Gita, years ago, you ran for president of Indonesia, or you, I know you're laughing, right? At least I could say you tried to run for president of Indonesia. For various reasons, the effort was not.
I thought we were going to avoid that, Don.
Yeah, well, I could, okay, but I mean, you can answer this very briefly.
Sure.
Do you have any desire, any thought? I mean, you've done so many other things. Why not add this to your curriculum vitae? Have you ever thought of running again?
No, never. And I've been very consistent in the last 7 years that I wanted to pursue, academic career and entrepreneurial career, and I've been very consistent. And it's a tough occupation, running a country. I'm sure you do know that, right? and it's not an easy proposition for people like me. And that was an experiment. That was an episode where I experimented with regards to the possibility, and certainly not the kind of experiment I want to dwell into again.
Let's talk a little bit about COVID-19 before we move into foreign policy. Indonesia ranks 49th out of 53 countries studied in Bloomberg's latest COVID resilience ranking. That poor performance is, of course, not solely attributable to the Indonesian government. Worldwide, the Delta variant obviously is making transmission easier. Myanmar, I might note, veering as it is towards civil war, is completely incapable of containing the virus, and indeed may be spreading it into neighboring countries and beyond. So who is to blame for the fact that as of last month, only 19% of eligible Indonesians had been fully vaccinated? How much responsibility would you allocate, for example, to the United States? What about the notion of, vaccine nationalism or conditional vaccine diplomacy? We could bring China into the conversation as well. Or are there real problems in Indonesia that have inhibited an appropriate response? Because I think it's fair to say that among the Indonesian, the Indonesian record on this is one of the worst in Southeast Asia. The two countries that have had the greatest number of deaths, of course, Philippines and Indonesia, and that's partly because they have large populations. But I think you can see where I'm headed. What is to be done? What is to be done?
Look, I think it's a supply and demand issue, right? We can talk about vaccine diplomacy, but I'm not aware of any nation or any country that would put priorities or more priorities on other people before they look after themselves, right? And at the moment, we're stuck with the reality that the supply could only come from a very finite set of countries. And those respective countries, I think, would have to take care of themselves first. And that's sort of like a systemic limit on everybody else that doesn't have the supply capabilities. We have actually gone over the 20% hurdle, with the first shot capability. I think we're at about 26% of the population. That's not a great number. I think the reality is that, as much as we've been able to vaccinate 1.5 million people a day, that would have taken place more in the primary cities before consideration of the secondary cities where the cold chain infrastructure is a lot more, if not somewhat more limited. That will only mean that the average per day vaccination rate is going to decline to probably around 300,000 to 500,000 per day. Now, let's use 500,000 per day. That takes you to about 15 million. In a month, that will take you to about 180 million in a year, right? But if you bring it down to 300,000 per day, that's 9 million in a month. It's about 100 million in a year. So you put all that in a context of 280 million people. So herd immunity is probably not going to be reached until probably end of 2022 or sometime in 2023. All that correlates with the degree to which or how early we're going to be able to recover economically comprehensively. And this is barring any new mutations, barring new variations, right? We've seen the Delta, the Mu, and we're yet to see more. So until and unless we can sort out our own domestic supply capability, until and unless we can sort out our external supply capabilities, be it from one country or the other, I think we're limited to the scenario that I've, just laid out. And this, I think, is quite a concern because COVID has impacted, first of all, the demand side of the economy. But I think, oh boy, it has impacted the supply side of the economy in a big way. I have seen, and we know this, how from the tiniest entrepreneurship to the largest entrepreneurship, how they have not been able to make the necessary adjustment because they have not been as open-minded as they should be. And how even those that have been able to be open-minded about adaptation, they all have basically been impaired, either temporarily, much less permanently. And that, I think, is going to affect how we're going to be able to compete, in the next few years with neighboring nations, if not beyond. So it discounts our ability to be victorious in the near future, at least. I'm not so sure about the long future, but that, I think, is the reality that's been shaped by COVID-19.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. That's a nice response, and I'm glad that it's. I mean, there's irrational optimism, and then there's thoughtful optimism, and the thoughtful optimism is exactly what you've just shared with us, and I appreciate that. Okay, on the climate change side, as of 2019, now these statistics I suppose should be updated, but this was all I could find. As of 2019, the biggest exporter of coal in the world was Indonesia. Australia came in second. What can be done about that? Given, of course, the implications for carbon in the atmosphere.
Look, I spend a lot of time on a daily basis telling people, lecturing people in classrooms about how much carbon is left. A lot of people don't know this, that, we've emitted, since 4.6 billion years ago, about 1,400 gigatons of carbon. A lot of people still don't know that we only have between 2 to 3,000 gigatons of carbon left on planet Earth. A lot of people don't know that we emit about 60 gigatons a year. And that basically limits our life expectancy if we were to continue consuming carbon or emitting carbon to roughly around 50 years. And I think what gives me optimism is that, if I talk to 10 people, about 3 to 4 people get it. And I'm optimistic that each one of the 3 or 4 people that get it, they're going to spread the wings. They're going to spread the word. And are we going to stop producing coal tomorrow? No, we're not. It is generational. But I think the kids with Gen Z, at some point, sooner rather than later, they're going to tell their parents to stop producing coal. That, I think, is a product of how quickly we can teach or share ideas and views with the young generation. Now, you put that in the context of the Paris Accord, right, where the world has to basically reduce carbon emission by 50% in 2030, another 25% by 2040, the last 25% by 2050. Are we going to get there? I'm actually quite optimistic that we're going to get there, not by way of policy, but I think it's by way of persuasion by the young generation. Call it civil society, but more so than not, technology. And I'm quite optimistic with respect to how stuff like solar technology has gotten so much better, not only in terms of absorbing, but also storing. And I think it's going to continue to be exponentially disruptive. A lot of people don't know that, the sun, arrives on planet Earth with energy equivalent to 8,000 times the amount that we're using on a daily basis. So it only depends on how quickly we can come up with the necessary technology that's going to be able to absorb and store and distribute. That, I think, will happen in the next 5 to 10 years. So going back to what you alluded earlier, we will probably be still the largest coal producer for a few years, but I think slowly, hopefully faster, the kids will start talking to their parents, and then technology will help come up with renewable strategies that will displace things that are not good for the country, for the planet.
Yeah, fair enough. I guess there's a little bit of a tension between sort of relying on persuading Generation Z on the one hand to do something because they're going to suffer the brunt of climate change more than you and I. And then on the other hand, the technological response. Just for purposes of debate, geoengineering could create moral hazard when people say, hey, no problem, we just put a bunch of sulfur particles up in the atmosphere and that'll reflect the sunlight back and we'll be fine. So don't even worry about it, right? I mean, that's of course an extreme interpretation, but there is a risk that a purely technological response will be insufficient, which is implied by your emphasis on Generation Z. And that raises a very different and frankly rather mysterious, at least to me, question. I have no real response to it. I think it's important, but I don't know what to do with it. And that is what I like to call chronological empathy. How do you have empathy with generations that do not yet exist, right? I can be empathic toward you and vice versa, but that's different. That's easy. We're facing each other, right? At least through the screen. But to try to have chronological empathy, that's extremely difficult. And how do you, for example, should we accord legal status, legal standing to the rights of future generations and weave that into national law? I mean, I know that's kind of a political science fiction sort of response from an academic, who doesn't really know a lot about reality, but still, how would you respond to the risk of geoengineering and the necessity for, a softer but perhaps more long-lasting approach to this difficult issue of trying to empower people who are not yet alive?
Honestly, I don't know, Don, the answer to that. But I know this, it's the onus is upon us, right, to rethink the narrative. We've got to stop thinking consumptively. We've got to start thinking regeneratively. We've got to stop thinking consumptively. We've got to start thinking and taking up citizenship, right? We've got to look at ourselves more as a citizen as opposed to consumer. And we've got to just use science more than anything otherwise. We've got to, at the end of the day, the non-existent generation or the soon-to-be existing generation ought to take political ownership. And this sort of like relates to the much earlier point about, how legislatures, have to do the right stuff for the future. You know how tough it is for good people in Indonesia to get interested in joining politics, right? But I do believe that if they take ownership with the urgency of stuff like climate change, and they know that without taking political ownership with respect to issues such as climate change, that things are not going to get better, I'm kind of like of the view that they are inevitably going to have to take political ownership. And that's when I think we're going to see some sort of an inflection point where, this era of systematic discouragement of talent within the political realm is going to change to an era where I think there's going to be tremendous encouragement of talent within the political realm. Just by way of issues that I think are main course in nature, stuff like climate change, inequality, financial inclusion, those are main course.
Okay, let me shift the topic a little, if I may. Over 4 days this past week, China's Air Force sent nearly 150 military aircraft to fly through Taiwan's air defense identification zone. Presumably, I suppose, in honor of the PRC's National Day on October 1st, although it's a rather unusual way of celebrating a holiday. Clearly, it was an unprecedented effort to intimidate Taiwan. Although it is very, at least in my opinion, very unlikely to happen so soon, very unlikely, extremely unlikely. Nevertheless, imagine that tomorrow China invades Taiwan. What, if anything, should Indonesia say or do?
I'm not yet of the view that Indonesia will be able to say anything assertive with regards to an episode like what you described. But I can say this, Indonesia is a country of scale, right? With 280 million people. You put that in a bigger basket, call that ASEAN, a region of close to 700 million people. I think if the region says something, it's got to be listened to some extent. And especially if the region is one filled with people with good education. A good education that basically leads the nation to a place where they can actually articulate, narrate the narratives eloquently and better substantively. That's going to happen in the future, right? And I envision a future where we're not going to be shackled by force us to choose one over the other, whether we're going to have to use just Huawei or iPhone, right? I think the cool thing about ASEAN is that we have a great chance of having optionalities, right? Just by the sheer scale. And not to mention that scale actually is situated in a really cool geostrategic spot that's going to be so geostrategically important to any countries, including China and the US. Will that episode be concerned? Absolutely. Will that have repercussions on the trafficking of goods and services, between countries, between zones? Yes. Will that have repercussions on how we're going to basically relate geopolitically with one over the other? Yes, I think temporarily. But again, I go back to history, right? The history between Southeast Asia and China is one where we've been characterized a lot more by commerce, not militaristic tendencies. Yes, there have been episodes, but those episodes actually occur when a particular dynasty was in existence for a relatively short period of time. So I want to be more on the optimistic side in that such episodes are not going to aggravate. And number two, that even if those episodes were to aggravate, Southeast Asia is still going to be able to stick together, not be divided by having to choose one over the other. And we're going to be able to continuously assert more assertively what we need to do together as members of the world. And that, I think, will happen in a good way if we go back to the earlier point of being able to democratize ideas and educate the people a little bit better.
Yeah, I mean, we could debate this business about not having to choose. It's a concern that I have spent a fair amount of time trying to ponder. And there is at least one aspect or one potential difficulty with that position of not having to choose, which bothers me. And that is insofar as one assigns moral equivalence to Beijing,
Right.
given what Beijing is doing in Xinjiang, what it is doing, what it did to Hong Kong, right? What it is doing towards Taipei, right? And I could go on and on. What it's doing in the South China Sea, including penetrating the North Natuna Sea and messing around inside Indonesia's exclusive economic zone, using its muscle. I mean, we could go on and on and on, right? So, and I'm not saying that the United States is virtuous, not at all. I mean, look at our past. Our past is a troubled past, Vietnam, Iraq. I mean, I could go on and on and on. We are not angels by any means. But nevertheless, it bothers me that, we have here a democracy, a highly flawed American democracy, that nevertheless does observe some basic principles that we associate with human rights, rights that are, simply inhere in the nature of being a human being. And we have a model in China which is radically opposed to that. And Indonesia is a democracy, admittedly, like the United States, a flawed democracy, but nevertheless a democracy. So if not having to choose means that the two alternatives are morally equal, then I'm sorry, I object to that. I have problems with that. And we could pursue that further. I guess that would open up the question that you raised with regard to ASEAN. Is ASEAN really the appropriate platform? Is ASEAN proactive? Is ASEAN able to resolve tensions in Southeast Asia? I'll be blunt. I think you know what my answer is. My answer is no, no. I mean, in a way, I'm glad that there is this mythology of ASEAN, because the mythology of ASEAN, that it is effective and all these good things, at least to some extent, keeps the elites in Southeast Asia believing in its existence. And I'm not suggesting that ASEAN should dissolve. Although I do notice that, as I'm sure you're aware, an analyst in Singapore, a Singaporean analyst, has actually already played with the idea of expelling Laos and perhaps Cambodia from ASEAN because they have become client states of China. And as you know, China is trying to divide ASEAN, to render it impotent by building up these client states, particularly Cambodia and Laos, so that they will never agree to a resolution adopted by ASEAN that is critical of China. So, I don't know how you would respond to that. The latest evidence, I suppose, which is really, really, really upsetting, is what ASEAN has done or not done with regard to Myanmar. Thousands of people, are at risk. The death rate, this is an absolutely vicious, forgive the language, evil regime. The Tatmadaw, the military in Myanmar, is engaging in murder on a mass scale inside the boundaries of Myanmar. And so here's ASEAN with Myanmar as a member. I wonder, for example, in November at the East Asia Summit, will the head of the junta be sitting at the table, and then the Southeast Asians will look to the United States and say, well, why aren't you here? Come on, what, you don't want to play ball? What is it? You're way the hell across the ocean. You don't even bother to come. We could do it electronically. Why aren't you here? And the Americans are thinking, how could we possibly sit at a table that would legitimate this awful, horrific, bloody regime in Myanmar? And, ASEAN has been completely paralyzed, completely unable. The 5 principles that they issue were pap. They were complete pap, right? They had no consequence whatsoever. And so the legitimation of this extraordinarily brutal regime in the context of ASEAN, roughly half of whose member countries, are already highly authoritarian. You could almost say that ASEAN is verging on becoming a club of dictators. Now, I'm being emotional here, not academic, partly to stimulate a response on your part. How do you respond?
I'm not disagreeing with a lot of the points you've articulated. ASEAN, I think, could have done a lot more with respect to Myanmar. At the risk of paraphrasing some friends of mine, I really think we shouldn't just have been, talking about not only human rights violations, but in terms of the commitment to stay as, sustainable democracies all across, right? And that could have been, I think, the narrative or part of the conversation or the topic of conversation. But we were not doing that. We have not been doing that as proactively as we should have been. Can that be remedied? It could, I think, by chance, if Indonesia were to show more leadership. And this, I think, is an observation, but also an opportunity for Indonesia to show a bit more, if not a lot more, leadership with respect to ASEAN, being the biggest economy in ASEAN, being the biggest population in ASEAN, about 43% of the economies and 43% of the population. Will that change? I'm hopeful that will change, that we're going to be able to show more leadership and strike the right kind of conversation with, the juntas and other relevant people in Myanmar. Now, going back to the earlier point on moral equivalence, look, not everybody's perfect, like you said, right? I'm not perfect. You're not perfect. We in Indonesia are not a perfect democracy. The United States is not a perfect democracy. China is not a perfect autocracy. But I boil it down to, I think, our cognizance with respect to how we're going to be able to build institutions, right? And I think that's the important thing. If I take a look at China as an autocracy and the United States as a democracy, there are observations where China has been able to actually show the building of institutions better than the United States. But there are also negative observations where China has not been able to, build institutions. Indonesia, I think, importantly, has to show as a democracy that it needs to be able to build institutions. And I think we're at risk right now because we're seeing some tendencies or observations where we have been witnessing some sort of deinstitutionalization of decision making. And that, I think, will discount our ability to do a few things, one of which is to show the kind of leadership within ASEAN so that we can tell the Chinese, we can tell the Americans, this is what matters to us in ASEAN.
Yeah, fair enough. What do you think of AUKUS? Australia, UK, United States. And the provision, long term, it'll take 2 decades, but the provision of nuclear powered submarines to Australia, which presumably would increase their capacity to pose some kind of deterrent to China. Is this a bad thing because it escalates the rivalry between Beijing and Washington into perhaps a full-fledged Cold War, or maybe even a cool war, hopefully not a hot war? Or is this a sensible response without waiting for ASEAN, for example, or for that matter, other multilateral organizations that would not be able to make this kind of a step? Is it something that's useful from an Indonesian point of view?
Look, there's no way that this initiative is not going to trigger or evoke the Chinese, right? And if we were to go back, right, the geopolitical narrative could have been through the TPP, right? Call it the need to contain China, right? But you guys, or all of us, missed a boat. Indonesia decided not to join the TPP narrative for a set of reasons. But that thing was basically put away in 2015 when somebody became a candidate for the 2016 elections. As of now, my observation is that within the current administration in the US, there's this belief that it doesn't serve to the extent of whatever purported strategic value that was thought of within the TPP framework. And I'm willing to bet that the United States is not likely to rejoin the comprehensive accelerated TPP, which ironically now China has decided to join, the bandwagon. In the absence of all this, would a trilateral type of collaboration on a non-economic basis, be it with the UK and Australia, or even a Quad with India, Australia, and Japan, be a necessary type of collaborative effort as to help contain, or I don't know, maybe limit, whatever China might do in an adverse manner to the United States or to the region where the United States has a vested interest in? It just seems like an inevitability, right? In the absence of the alternative economic route to geostrategically or geopolitically contain or limit China's moves. If the question is with regards to whether or not this would be effective in containing or limiting China, I'm not so sure. Because China, I think, has the propensity to do things on an accelerated basis in a number of respects. And that cannot be underestimated. And I think I'm hopeful that this is just part of the long-term bargaining so that we can continue to sustain peace and stability in the region.
Fair enough. There is a a question from one of the attendees, from Wildan Yandi, who says, "I'm a fan of the Endgame podcast." So that's good. That's good to know. There's a part where Mr.
Thank
Gita at the end of the interview on Endgame, asks the guest about how Indonesia will be in the year 2045. And the answers are very interesting. I ask you to ask this question to Mr. Gita. What does Gita think about Indonesia? What will it be in 2045?
You know, I'm a half glass full kind of guy. I'm not a half empty, glass kind of guy. I envision a future. Look, Endgame, by way of background, was something that we kind of experimented as an idea to educate not just Indonesians, but Indonesianists, involving Indonesians and Indonesianists, people that actually care about where Indonesia needs to be. And that makes it inevitably an educational platform. And we would talk about entrepreneurship, geopolitics, digitization, you name it. We try to stay away from politics. We try to stay away from things that I believe or we believe are not value additive to where Indonesia wants to be in 2045. I do envision Indonesia in 2045 as a place where, we've become pretty good, if not very good narrators of the region, not just Indonesia. And this would, dovetail into how we're going to shape the educational narrative of Indonesia so that we can create different pillars, different verticals that are going to be necessary for, be it job creation, moving up the value chain, peace and stability, being able to connect with the world a lot better than we ever have, and being able to play the role of bridging between Islam and the West, being able to play the role of bridging between China and the US, being able to civilizationally bridge between civilizations. That's sort of like a big ask, but it's 24 years, right? And let's not forget how we have transformed as a relatively thriving democracy in just 23 years, ever since 1998, as opposed to having been balkanized, like many pundits have been saying earlier on. So that gives me optimism on the basis that, we've been able to stay peaceful and stable, and on the basis that we can actually create the necessary kinds of conversations that would continue to democratize ideas. And it doesn't take 280 million people. It only takes maybe 10 to 20 people that get it, and they can spread their wings. Then they can just basically, it's sort of like a multi-level marketing type of strategy. If one guy surrounds himself with 5 people that are of the same kinds of attributes as the guy that surrounds himself with 5 people, and each one of the 5 people would surround himself or herself with, 5 of the same, if not better attributes, oh boy, it could be exponential.
You know me pretty well, and at the risk of being a little bit playful, I believe in the dialectic, right? So
Yep.
if your
Yep.
thesis is in some sense optimistic, which I think it is, then the antithesis has to be pessimistic,
Sure.
so that eventually we can get a synthesis which is reasonable, right? I mean, sketching it out. Okay, so let me provide the antithesis. A very pessimistic view of the world and of the future. And I'm not saying that I 100% believe this, but I think it is worth considering. Okay, so consider the following question. What is the nature of the problem that we face, or the problems in the plural that we face? Is there a characteristic that one can notice about those problems that are now, that are today, that are part of a planet that has been increasingly intra-woven, right, through globalization and so forth, where what happens in one part of the world then tends to have repercussions in some other part of the world, even far away. Okay. And the argument would run something like this. Imagine 2 different kinds of problems. One problem, let's call it a mandate problem.
Right.
So that, if a factory wants to build by a riverside, and the consequences of that are going to mean pollution of the river, then it makes sense for the village that would be affected to have a chance in a referendum, let's say, at least, or some kind of a meeting to express its point of view, right? Which would then be taken into account, presumably, by the company's point of view and so forth and so on, right? So that there's a mandate of some kind, right? And there's no real urgency here because, well, obviously the company would like to do it as soon as possible, but so it postponed till next year or something, no problem, right? So arguably that is precisely the kind of problem that a democracy can deal with. Now look at a radically different kind of problem. It's the cockpit problem. The pilot sees a plane right ahead, coming straight at him. He's not going to get on the public address system and say, oh, by the way, passengers, I would like a vote on whether I should turn left or, hey, maybe I should turn right or maybe up or maybe down, okay? So, the steward and stewardesses will be coming down the aisle to take your votes and it'll all be very democratic. And by that time, they're all dead. And the proposition here is that the world in the 21st century is increasingly burdened by cockpit problems. And the only way you can solve a cockpit problem is by concentrating power in the hands of the pilot, which means bad news for democracy and possibly also good news for the technologists that are providing the capacity, the digital capacity, to control societies in a way that they have never been controlled in the past. And China being, of course, a classic example of the ability of using technology to essentially erode the freedom of action of individuals throughout the country, not to mention throughout the world. So what do you think of this projection that what we notice as a decline in democracy is not just a happenstantial matter? Okay, so it declines and then it'll go up again and maybe down again. No, it's a secular trend, and that we are moving towards an authoritarian world of necessity, because that's the only way you can begin to respond to these new problems that are going to beset us continually, whether it's climate change or whatever.
Look, authoritarianism sells when there are problems, right? Extreme problems. And I think we got to be very careful here about how we classify ourselves as a democracy. I'm of the view that I think democracies, their shape has changed, and I think more for the worse. And I think it has been shaped or reshaped by technology, where we have gotten accustomed to equating freedom of expression with algorithmic amplification, right? This notion that, the digital platform is one where bad information is something that's going to be left out there and it will get neutralized by a commensurate amount of good information. But the real concern is that the digital platform has allowed for amplification algorithmically for asymmetry of information. That, I think, is a danger to democracy. And that, I think, is a concern and a danger to how we define expression or freedom of expression. That needs to be taken a view of. And if it doesn't get taken a view of, it will affect how we're going to be able to thrive as democracy and how we're going to be able to democratize talents and ideas. So, am I in agreement with what China is doing by way of using technology to suppress? No. That not only stifles creativity, but that is probably not the kind of stuff that we want to do. It may be the kind of stuff that China wants to do, but that should not be what Indonesia should do, right? But what Indonesia has done, or what the United States has done, or what other democracies have done, is allowed for the digital platform to basically allow for greater and greater degree of misinformation, where they just continue to evoke hatred, any narratives that tend to just divide people. And this is reflected empirically, right? In not only how conversations have gotten polarized, ideas have gotten polarized, but I'm sort of like in the camp that believes that polarization of ideas correlates with inequality, right? Gini coefficient ratios have gone up in the US and China. They're what 48, and Indonesia at 38. It is reflective of an era where we have seen a greater tendency of the elitization of money. And I think COVID makes it worse in the sense that by way of the deceleration of economic growth, it makes it more difficult to redistribute welfare to the poor or to the, less than whatever. And it is sort of like what I call the reverse Robin Hood phenomenon, where the rich are actually stealing from the poor by way of the rising Gini coefficient ratio. And this elitization of money, I think, has something to do with how we're not doing much or how we're not doing enough about how digital platforms are actually dividing nations more than anything. So I think the question is more with respect to how we're going to need to reshape ourselves if we want to thrive as a good, robust democracy, as opposed to being critical of what China does. Or we can be critical of what China does, but I think we should be a lot more critical about what we're not doing enough of. That, I think, is important for nation building.
Should Facebook be a public utility?
I think it should, but I think it should be better regulated. And it has become too monopolistic. And history tells us monopolies are not good for not only the economy, but also for the nation and for nation building. But the fact of the matter is that the regulatory framework is one that would have been built during the steam engine era for purposes of managing, regulating stuff that would have been propelled by a completely different type of technology. And that, I think, is the reality where we're seeing how the private enterprise is moving at such an exponential rate, where the policymaking body is moving at such a linear rate. And that divergence, I think, is a major problem for how we want to maintain ourselves as a robust democracy.
Well, we're getting close to the end. So I want to go back to the beginning. I want to go back to your life. And one question from Jovita Putri asks, and I'd like to elaborate on it a little bit if I could, asks, in your life, how much of a role has been played not by your diligence, your intelligence, and so forth and so on, but by luck, sheer blind luck? And then a related question from me, again, going back to your biography, which is this. Are there any things in that biography, choices you made perhaps, that you regret? And that if you had them to do over, you would do differently? That's a very personal question. You don't have to answer that, actually, come to think of it. Here we are. We've got about 400 people watching this, and I'm acting like a shrink.
I will answer those, Don. I'll answer those. Look, I mean, luck to some extent is correlated with what zip code you're born, right? And I can claim that I've been lucky to have been born out of my parents in whatever zip code I was born in, and I think my parents were very good at shaping me to be diligent. I'm not a believer in talent, to be quite honest. When I do stuff seemingly better than others, that's because I spent a heck of a lot of time on it. A lot of people don't know I spent 8 hours a day playing the piano for years. And that's not talent. That's hard work. That's diligence. And you put this in the context of, the digital world, right? I'm puzzled by the fact that out of 24 hours, we spent 8 hours a day working, 8 hours sleeping, and 8 hours looking at our handphones. Most people, their screen time is at least 8 hours now. I just don't get it. Why the hell are they not spending some, if not a lot of that 8 hours, those 8 hours, reading books or reading journals from, APARC, or, I don't know, interacting with people in good quality, if not high quality. And that, I think, has to do with the algorithmic amplification that needs to be looked at diligently, if not taken a view of. And nobody's taken a view of stuff like this. And it is something that I believe requires some sort of a social re-engineering. If we were not to socially re-engineer ourselves, I think we're at risk in terms of being able to sustain ourselves as robust democracies. On the second question, I have no regrets with respect to successes, if not the many failures I've gone through. Oh boy, I mean, a lot of people don't know that I've gone past, so many failures, and success is usually at the end of so many failures, right? But would I have made different choices of actions? No, I would not. Not ever. I'm happy, with the choices that I've made all my life, and I'm going to continue making choices. And those may not be the wisest, those may not be the best, but those are going to lead up to the kind of wisdom that I think I'm going to attain.
Well, that's well said. I mean, I share very much the notion that what really matters in a way in one's life is not so much the successes as the failures. I can't quite say that I enjoy failing, but I do learn from it, and I don't always learn from the successes. I think my colleagues know that I prefer to be criticized. I may disagree, but I can learn. But if somebody
Right.
says, gee, Don, that was a great article. Well, yeah, okay, thank you. But what was wrong with it? That's what I want to know. Otherwise, self-improvement becomes a little tricky.
Right.
Are there any
Right.
questions that you would like to ask that I have ignored? Ask of yourself, for example.
No, I don't. You've asked a lot of really tough questions, Don.
You're sure? Okay.
I'm up to my quota.
Let me just, I've spent time on your biography, which is the past. And I know now that you're unlikely to run for president, which is the future. But what does the future hold for you? What sort of plans do you have? What would you like to do or do next or become?
I see myself as somebody that's going to spend a lot more time in the academic domain. And here's a cool thing about it. When I go into a classroom and speak in front of, I don't know, 5 students or 500 students, I feel really good. I can just talk for 2 to 3 hours, sometimes more. I usually open up the discussion more to the students for them to ask questions. I usually don't spend any more than 20 minutes, just talking, doing a prologue, and then I would open it up and I'll take questions in a random manner coming from different people, different directions, different topics. And it goes back to what we were talking about, right? This range. It allows me to just keep on widening my range, and it makes me feel good. I like that. And I want to spend the rest of my life doing things I like. not doing things I don't like just to make money. You know,
And by implication, your business career, looking back, which has been quite successful, not to mention your time as a member of a cabinet, Indonesian cabinet, as Minister of Trade,
Right.
for example. One might assume that those roles, which are heavily institutional, might have imposed certain constraints that now you're free to sort of emerge from and become an academic in a much more free-forming kind of way, interacting with students and so forth in the classroom. Yeah. I wonder if that
Absolutely.
experience, looking 5 years ahead, let's say, will make you less optimistic than you are now. I mean, I don't know, if you were to do an objective study of academics around the world, I mean, this is obviously political science fiction. Would you find that academics are more optimistic or more pessimistic, depending, of course, on the topic?
I think
And my
for the
sense,
most part, yeah.
pardon me?
For the most part, I would say more on the pessimistic side.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah.
No, I agree. I think, and we can, well, that's part of another session to investigate academe, right? Which is, that's a topic close to my heart, but I think we'll have to postpone that for another occasion. Our time is up. I'm sorry to those who asked questions that we didn't have time to include. I want to thank you, Giwok. Giwok, that's my boss, right? I want to thank you, Gita.
sounds
Yeah,
okay.
for a wonderful session. I've enjoyed it immensely, and I hope very much that the several hundred people who have followed this conversation have also enjoyed it as much as I have. And I want to thank again your colleagues who have helped put this together, and my colleague here, particularly Lisa Lee, who has helped manage it from our end. And that's it. Terima kasih banyak, and sampai ketemu lagi.
Sama. It's been swell.
Take care.
swell.
All the
Thank
very
you, Don.
thank you.
Thank you, Don.
Yeah. Bye-bye.